Hello everybody, and welcome to this instalment of What Does the Future Sound Like with Francesca Ter-Berg. How would you describe yourself, Francesca? Musician, composer, cellist, creator extraordinaire?
Thank you. Probably all of those things. Yeah, in terms of my instrument, cello is my main instrumental practice. I definitely dabble at lots of other instruments, and yeah, I've been exploring and learning klezmer music for the past 13 years, and I've also traveled to Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe and parts of the US to study with Romanian musicians and Hungarian musicians from the Roma tradition, and also the more like national folk styles, and also, yeah, I'm from London, so I've also been very immersed in the kind of melting pot of the London music scene, the jazz scene, the world music scene, the experimental scene. I sort of span many genres and styles, which is sometimes a bit confusing for people, but I just don't like to I don't really see these things as separate from each other. So I just kind of do whatever I like, really.
Why we were so excited to talk to you, actually, that kind of melting pot of influences and ability to slip into those spaces that are in between the main kind of classifications of genre, I suppose.
Yeah,
it's what's really exciting to us. So I thought we might kind of hook into our conversation by talking a little bit about one track that I'd been listening to that kind of inspired me to think about how your work is maybe a little bit reflected in the collection of the museum. So I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, but the track is Mein Ruheplatz, which means my resting place. I think that's correct. And that's a setting with your group, Fran and Flora, of a poem by Maurice Rosenfeld. And before we kind of get into what the link is with our collection, I wondered if you could just talk about that track a little bit, like how you went about composing that.
So that Mein Ruheplatz is it's in the sort of Yiddish repertoire. It's on the more well-known side. It's been recorded quite a few times. Actually, June Tabor did a version, which I absolutely love. And I first heard it when I went to Canada, which is a big Klezmer festival in the mountains in Quebec in 2007. And I just finished my undergraduate degree, which was in anthropology, and I wanted to be a musician, and I'd fallen in love with klezmer music. And I heard a friend of mine, Daniel Kahn, who's an amazing musician and sort of Yiddish poet himself. He performed it, and I just fell in love with it. But I never thought that I could ever sing it myself, because it kind of meant too much for me, and because it's a bit of a classic, and you don't want to go in and sort of do a kind of, I guess, a cover of a classic song like that and not do it justice. But when me and Flora were making our album, we needed another track, and something inside me was like, let's give it a go. So we started working on it.
Niet zoek mich wo, die lieten grinen, du findest mich dort, nicht mein Schatz. Wo Lebenswelken, Bäume schienen, dort ist mein Ruheplatz. Oh, dort ist mein Ruheplatz. Niet zoek mich wo, die Wege singen, du findest mich dort, nicht mein Schatz. Als Schlaf bin ich, wo Ketten klingen, dort ist mein Ruheplatz. Oh, dort ist mein Ruheplatz.
It's Maurice Rosenfeld wrote the lyrics, and apparently his daughter wrote the melody. I was searching for her name online and I can't find it, but I feel that if I can find it, I'm going to send it to you, because especially because women never get the credit.
Yeah.
I think her name needs to be, you know, if we can put some show notes or something, then her.
It's interesting that the name is hard to find as well. That's very typical, isn't it? But
yeah, I do have it somewhere. And the melody that I'm singing actually is the kind of traditional, well, the melody that was written in the 20s, but I changed the last verse because like our process is very organic, so we were working on it. I sang it and we played it, and it was a live performance, just me and Flora with our arrangement, and we wrote this instrumental section in between, and it just didn't sound good enough, and we were in the process of making our album more experimental and studio based, and I didn't know what to do because I'd never really worked with song in this way, being more of like an instrumentalist, and I just started studying kind of studio practice at Goldsmiths, and I was like, let's mess with this. And our producer, Sam Best, he's a amazing musician, and we just decided, let's double track it, kind of like, I don't know, a grime track or something. So we double tracked the vocals, and it sounded really cool because, like, I'm not a trained singer, and it's the first time I'd ever recorded my voice, and then it's like, that's cool, but it needs something else. So what we did was we processed the strings through a bit crush pedal in like different rhythms, and it just sounded cool, and then we went from there.
Well, when I was listening to it, I was thinking it really, there's something in it, and maybe that is the process that you've just described, that felt really kind of heartfelt, and yet quite unusual and quite attractive sonically to me. And it made me think of, we have a story in our collection of a man called Benny Rothman, who was born in Cheetham Hill in Manchester in the early 20th century. And he was the son of Romanian migrants, and you know, had a hard life, had to leave school very young to support his family when his father died, which is a very common experience. And a lot of people in Cheetham are working in kind of small factories, sweatshops, which is kind of similar to the story in My Resting Place. It's kind of a similar situation, I suppose, in some ways to New York, where the track is set. But Benny, he became a mechanic, sort of a manual garage worker. I think really he wanted to be an academic. He was quite academically gifted at school, and so he gets involved in the Young Communist League in Manchester. So he becomes politicised. He's very into rambling and going out to the countryside and playing tennis and ping pong and all those kinds of social activities around the kind of the politics of the Young Communist League. But there's a moment in the early 30s where the people who go out rambling in the Peak District are stopped from going onto land that's owned by the aristocracy. Basically, they are employing thugs to patrol the land. There is sort of physical violence if you try to trespass, and so Benny is one of the key members in this sort of boiling over of anger about this injustice that the people can't have access to the land, that becomes the Kinder Scout trespass demonstrator in the early 30s. And we've got a photograph of them, and I don't know, for some reason, listening to that track, and it just made me think of you. So I'm just going to share that photograph now. So here they are, and Benny is circled, his face is circled in the centre. So they're not solely from the Jewish community, but many of them are from the Jewish communities who are involved in both the Young Communist League and other political organisations. But they march up to Kinder Scout. They realise that if they march in big enough numbers, that the thugs who are patrolling the land can't physically get at all of them. I just love them all in their shorts and their long.
It's an amazing
photo. It's amazing.
Yeah, with their knees, so English, isn't it? With their knees out.
Yeah. I think that there's something really there's something quite radical. There's a history of radicalism in the Jewish communities in Manchester and in London as well. Of course, a lot of Mancunian Jews went down to Cable Street and were involved in a Cable Street situation. And so, yeah, I was just thinking about whether you see these kinds of stories that you're setting in Mein Ruhenplatz and the sorts of stories like Benny Rothman's stories, those unheard stories, really. Do you see that as a kind of radical act in terms of giving voice to those people? Is that a word that you would use to describe your music?
I don't use the word radical to describe my music, but I think in terms of, let's say, like Jewish identity in the UK, for example, is already, it's essentially it's a minority culture. Mm-hmm. But within that, there's a mainstream voice and, the sun has come out. There's a mainstream voice and there are the counter voices. And when I was growing up, I didn't feel that kind of the Judaism or some of the Jewish cultural kind of norms really fitted well with me. And when I went to university and started meeting different types of Jews to the types the community I grew up with, I found more common ground, and it was definitely in the sort of more subversive type of personalities, because it was all about questioning, which is deeply Jewish, actually. And I realized that I could sort of reclaim my relationship to Judaism, which in some ways is radical, because I went on a journey of questioning what I knew in order to understand myself more deeply and to understand my relationship to my upbringing and the people around me and my history and like the Jewish history. It's very complex, but it was an amazing experience. I actually, I did a degree in social anthropology, so I got to write about that for my dissertation, which was really amazing. And then I kind of put that all to bed, but as I was finishing my degree, I came across Klezmer music, and it just sort of struck me inside, and I felt that it was something that connected me to this sort of new Jewish identity that I was building for myself, which was more based around sort of understanding tradition and practice, probably from a more radical perspective. And I found that a lot of other people drawn to klezmer music in Yiddish feel similarly. Everybody has a different kind of relationship to it. It's all very personal, but there is a unification between us, which I think is that we're trying to understand this culture that was, or like learn about it, rather than kind of bin it, which, to be a bit harsh, is a kind of what's happened in the mainstream Jewish kind of identity. That, you know, things of the past, and we are in the present, and we're building this new sort of Jewishness. But it's you know, a song like Mein Ruheplatz, I heard it and it kind of broke my heart. It's so beautiful. The lyrics are incredible. It's a love song, and it's written from the perspective of someone who died in a factory fire. So you get that a lot in British folk song and folk songs all over the world, where the person who's singing is actually dead. Yeah. So that's quite amazing, and he or she is talking to their lover in the living world, and sort of saying, if you love me, come to me, in my resting place, but that my resting place is with the machines and the gnashing chains of the factory, not in the beautiful green pastures that you might imagine people rest.
In the past year as well, the idea that people are working in very difficult working conditions, often in economies that are not seen, or kind of underground economies. I think it has that resonance that, you know, if you assume that history is linear in one straight line and it's progressively getting better, actually this counteracts that. There's a kind of, it seemed to me like a sort of, it acts as a little hook into a circle being created, where we can be a bit more analytical rather than just, as you were talking about before, just kind of dismissing the past.
yeah, it gives like an amazing kind of context and like rooting for that. I guess it gives a voice to people that are basically not thought about as individuals. Do you know what I mean? Like you think of like factory workers,
faceless people, nameless
faceless.
people. We
It
were
gives a voice
talking
to
a bit
faceless,
before about the importance of naming,
Mm.
and actually naming as a kind of radical act. If your name is said, you are forgotten, and we do that in all kinds of ways, don't we? In the heritage sector, we do it. We were talking yesterday with Anna Silvera about doing that in terms of Kaddish, and
what's really nice, I suppose, is that these things, you know, continue on in life, like these conditions, these kind, you know, working class sort of working conditions and all of that, but that as someone who's interested in klezmer music and the Yiddish tradition, you find a song like that, and it's really warming that it's like, well, that just resonates with my values. And so it's not just a really great song and a really great melody, but it kind of makes me feel like my feelings have a home that comes from somewhere, that my beliefs have a home that comes from somewhere. It supports me in who I am as a person. And Yiddish culture is full of amazing poems and stories like this. And I just feel like, I don't know, if I hadn't have kind of, at the age of 22, kind of heard klezmer music in a Jewish squat in East London, I don't know what I'd be doing right now, quite honestly. I
kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about Yiddish itself, in terms of how the difference between the choice of singing in Yiddish as opposed to English translation or other languages, and is there a particular quality of Yiddish that feels more appropriate to those stories, or that is a reclaiming of a culture somehow? How do you feel about, I suppose, emotionally about Yiddish as a language?
I think Yiddish is like one of the most expressive languages in the world. It's amazing. I don't speak Yiddish, and I can't really read it. It's something I might spend time doing. I mean, I spent most of my time learning the music and focusing on style and feel, and singing in Yiddish. I never thought I could do it. I never thought that would be something I would do until we made the album, and that was a really great feeling, and it's encouraged me to keep going with it. But I was like, you know, my real knowledge is the inside outs of the music. And, you know, spending time with Alan Byrne and Frank London and Dan Blacksburg and people who have Cookie Siegelstein and amazing fiddler, and people who've been working on this music for their entire lives, and they're incredible musicians and kind of ethnomusicologists of the Jewish tradition. And but of course the Yiddish vernacular is expressed within the music, so I'm very familiar with that anyway, because to do the ornaments of the melodies and things like that in the tunes, you're essentially sort of emanating the vernacular of the Yiddish conversational style, and also the cantorial kind of some of the cantorial ornaments and melisma and stuff from the synagogue music.
What I also kind of wanted to ask you, which came out in our group discussion as well, is sort of to get your thoughts really about how Jewish music can be nourished now. Like what's the future? Like what needs to happen to maintain or increase that kind of really progressive, kind of radical, however we define that, quality in this music, which seems so exciting at the moment? Do you have a grand plan? World takeover.
I think I might have done once, and I'm not sure I do anymore. It's ticking along, you know. Actually, the pandemic has been really great for building online community, as we discussed yesterday in the group conversation. And in the last sort of 8 months, all these new groups and forums have been set up, because a lot of this music, obviously I don't want to kind of keep it as a sort of relic, but obviously to understand the music, one has to delve into the past, listen to archival recordings, look at the breadth of the material, try and understand it conceptually, philosophically, musically, all of those things. But not much of it has been digitized or like kind of made accessible online. Lots more stuff is on Spotify and YouTube now, like these archival recordings. So really, there's no excuse. If someone wants to learn klezmer music, okay, if you type klezmer into YouTube, you might not come up with some of this juicy, good stuff. You might come up with some sort of pretty average recording, because it's whoever writes the best, the most grabby, taglines is what comes up first. But there's been an initiative, I guess, from maybe some of the younger people involved in the international scene to make this stuff more accessible. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of online forums and conversations, mostly on Facebook now. People are putting up scores. You can ask questions. All the world's experts who've been studying this for the last 40, 50 years, they're all on there. Mm-hmm. If you want to find out something about klezmer music, you go onto like the Beregovsky collection forum on Facebook, which was only set up in like April or May, and you can ask Josh Horowitz, you can ask Joel Rubin, you can ask Frank London, you can ask Alan Byrne, you can ask Michael Alpert. These are people who literally hold the knowledge, and they're just like, yeah, I've got that in my archive, I'll send it to you. Do you know what I mean? I'll answer that question. Let's discuss these things. So there's some really nerdy stuff going on right now. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking in terms of like the wider international Jewish music community. Like when I've traveled around going to Weimar and Yiddish New York, and I was going to be at Klez Canada, there's some really exciting things going on in those spaces, particularly with sort of radical left-wing ideas, and lots of conversations around gender, which is really interesting, and like kind of gender specifically in the Jewish kind of cultural context. And Polina was involved in organising a international conference about that kind of thing. And I think the UK we could have a real part to play in all of those conversations. And I think at the moment, in some times it feels like the UK is a little bit missed off that kind of international Jewish cultural map. Like New York is a huge hub, and Germany and Berlin is a huge hub. But there's, clearly from at least 5 of us here, there's loads to be said and done here with what we're doing. And I think it would be nice to see us, and I think maybe the Manchester Jewish Museum's reopening could be a big part of that, of like putting UK British Jewish culture a bit more on the map and on the circuit, by kind of, I guess maybe thinking about how, I think you also sent us through a question about like our radical ways of exploring our work, and like opening up these conversations to like what does that mean, and what can we look like, and what do we want to do with what we have, and how do we reach people to make that happen. And I think like a shining example of that over lockdown was Ilana Kravitz, who like just smashed out an amazing online festival, and then also this Nigunim project, which brought together, like the lineup was like unreal. To be on a Zoom call with people whose like music have been, has inspired me since I was, really, really small.
And is that, I suppose I'm just thinking in terms of the museum's work, I often feel quite a level of responsibility to the stories of the people that I'm bringing to an artist, or that we are showing somehow. And that can be quite a weight of responsibility. Like, am I doing the right thing for this person's story? And of course, it's always just a tiny snapshot or an interpretation of somebody's life. And I feel that quite deeply sometimes, well, quite often. And I suppose, is there something about performing to non-Jewish audiences or non-folk audiences that releases that responsibility a little bit, that it's easier to tell those stories somehow, that there isn't extra weight and baggage?
In some ways, perhaps that's true. It's almost a bit like performing to your friends is scarier than performing to strangers. I find.
Yes.
Doing a house concert much scarier than doing a show in the Royal Festival Hall, for example. It's different kind of scary.
Playing for a friend's wedding, most nervous area.
Oh my God. I feel like I can never do that again. It's so stressful.
Yeah, I put a stop to it.
But in terms of the future, we haven't really. It's really hard to see the future right now for me. I'm very excited about all these online shenanigans and all the sort of sharing and open platform educational sort of resources that are being put out there. That's fantastic. On the other hand, I just don't know how we're going to kind of come together and grow beyond that. And like I say, if I was a new person coming in, a lot of people on these forums know each other really deeply.
Yeah.
And you're coming in as a new person, and it might feel quite exclusionary. And it's much easier to go to a workshop and be with a group of people and share. It's embodied, isn't it? It's a shared experience. And we can embody ourselves online, but it's not the same. So I'm not sure, through what me and Flora are doing, and other projects like that we're reaching a broader audience. And we are going to work on a second album soon, and hopefully release that towards the end of next year, probably spring 2022 now.
Whose voice